Hey guys, tonight we begin medieval universities argued over. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Yveet's late evening in the year 1322, and the bell of Merton College in Oxford tolls a slow and familiar rhythm. Outside, the stone walls, the streets of the small university town, are beginning to empty, save for a few apprentices rolling up market carts or pulling in shutters. But inside the college dormitories, candle flames flicker across rows of wooden desks, illuminating parchment, inkwells, and faces etched with concentration. One student yawns, another scratches his head with a goose feather quill, and above them all hung on a thick oak beam, a placard reads plainly, "Lights out at Compline." This isn't just a polite suggestion, it's university policy. And in the early 14th century, policies like this, seemingly mundane, were subjects of hot debate, official decrees, and, at times, even street brawls between students and town officials. At the heart of it all was one fundamental question. When should students go to bed? First glance, it seems laughably trivial. But in medieval universities like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna, bedtimes weren't just about sleep. They were about authority, control, religious discipline, economic tension, and intellectual structure. To understand why bedtimes mattered, one must first understand what it meant to be a university student in medieval Europe. A different kind of student life, medieval universities were not places of comfort or ease. They were institutions carved out of monastic traditions and grafted onto urban centers that barely tolerated their presence. Oxford, for example, was a cramped, often filthy town. Its streets were uneven, and its buildings a mix of timber and stone, often draped with the smells of tanneries and open sewers. Into this scene came boys as young as 30, and most students were in their early to mid-teens. When they began, their lives were highly regulated. The daily routine began before sunrise with matins early morning prayers, followed by a rigid schedule of lectures, disputations, and theological readings, often lasting into the evening. Meals were simple and quiet, often consisting of pottage, bread, and ale. Recreation was minimal and tightly monitored. Why? Because these universities were originally conceived as religious institutions. While they became centers of law, medicine, and philosophy over time, their roots were monastic. So like monks, students were expected to live disciplined lives. Sleep, therefore, wasn't a matter of personal preference, it was a spiritual and communal act governed by rules. Lighting the night, the candle controversy, the regulation of bedtime wasn't just about lights out. It was also about who was allowed to burn candles and for how long. Candles were expensive. A tallow candle might cost a day's wages for a poor student, while beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and longer, were even more costly. In the early 1300s, some colleges began providing communal candles for night study, but this raised new problems. Firstly, it created inequalities. Wealthier students could afford private lighting, while poorer scholars had to finish their reading before sunset or risk punishment for unauthorized candle use. Secondly, it raised fire hazards. Student dormitories, often wooden or partially timber, were vulnerable to fire. One overturned candle, and an entire college could go up in smoke. To mitigate this, some colleges like Peterhouse in Cambridge instituted formal candle policies. These dictated when candles could be lit, how many hours they could burn, and who was responsible for extinguishing them. In some places, bed checkers or porters patrolled dormitories to enforce bedtime curfews and confiscate illicit candles. But this enforcement met resistance. Students, especially those preparing for examinations or disputations, complained bitterly that early curfews impeded their studies. Some even petitioned college rectors for extended lighting privileges, an absurdly bureaucratic phrase that, in essence, meant, "Please let us study longer without getting into trouble." The university authorities were caught in a dilemma. It's too strict, and they risked intellectual stagnation and student rebellion. It's too lenient, and they risked fires, inequality, and social discord. So instead of finding compromise, universities did what bureaucracies often do. They wrote longer rules. When town met gown, the bedtime argument didn't stay inside the colleges. It spilled into the streets in the ongoing conflict between town and gown. Townspeople viewed students as arrogant, unruly freeloaders. Oh, gownmen. As students and professors were called, believed townspeople were greedy and uncultured. This friction was present across Europe, but especially acute in Oxford. Late-night candle burning was oddly a flashpoint. Why? Because it meant students stayed awake, wandered the streets after curfew, and sometimes visited taverns. By 1340, many towns had their own curfews bells rung at 8 or 9 p.m. meant to clear the streets and prevent unrest. Students, burning candles and studying late, often ignored these bells. They argued their scholarly duties required it. In one case, recorded in the register of the University of Paris, a student was attacked by a town watchman for walking past curfew with a candlelit lantern. The university filed a complaint. The town responded by banning students from carrying any open flame after sunset unless escorted by faculty. The students responded with a strike refusing to attend lectures until the right to nocturnal study was restored. Again, at the heart of this conflict was more than bedtime. It was a struggle over space, authority, and who governed the rhythms of urban life. Civic leaders or scholastic institutions. The role of bells and the monastic clock. Universities borrowed heavily from monastic timekeeping. Before mechanical clocks became widespread, time was marked by bells' manual signals indicating the canonical hours. These hours structured the day around prayers, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The final bell of the day, compline, signaled bedtime, but it was approximate. It depended on daylight and the judgment of the bell ringer. During winter, this meant students were expected to retire earlier, sometimes as early as 6 p.m. in summer. The curfew could stretch past 9 p.m. This shifting bedtime added confusion and frustration. A student studying Aristotle might find himself cut off mid-syllogism simply because the sun had set earlier than expected. Protests erupted at Cambridge in 1373 when a change in the bell schedule moved compline up by half an hour. The adjustment, though seemingly minor, was said to diminish the time of study unduly. Interestingly, these complaints indirectly pushed innovation. Some early horologist scholars of timekeeping began experimenting with more precise ways to measure hours. Water clocks, candle clocks, and even rudimentary weight-driven mechanical clocks began appearing in university towns. It's not entirely inaccurate to say that the annoying problem of inconsistent bedtimes helped push forward the technology of timekeeping. A Student's Perspective, one of the few surviving student journals from this period, belongs to a Parisian scholar named Jean Leblond, who wrote in 1318, "The bell rings for sleep, yet my eyes refuse it. I know not if I shall master the treatise by dawn, but if I sleep now, I surely will not. The candle grows low. It is my last." Jean's words are striking. They show the anxiety and discipline of medieval learning. These students weren't lounging in libraries or wandering through fields of thought. They were racing against flickering candles, rigid rules, and public expectations. And yet, despite all this, bedtime remained a subject of near-endless administrative back and forth. In 1411, the University of Bologna published a regular De Tempore Dormitionis, a rule on the time of sleeping, which outlined acceptable hours for rest, times for reading in silence, and penalties for violation. Among the rules, students could not converse in dormitories after compline, lest their words trouble the minds of those who wished to sleep. Candles were to be extinguished by the watchman, unless explicit permission had been granted for theological reading. A regulation of the mind in the end, bedtime rules were not just about regulating students' sleep, they were about regulating their minds. Two medieval authorities: sleep was necessary, but also dangerous. Too little sleep made one rash, too much indulgent. The ideal scholar, like the ideal monk, walked a careful, balanced, disciplined, alert, and obedient. And so, bedtimes became battlegrounds. Not because students loved rules, but because the very act of deciding when to rest, when to think, and when to stop thinking became a symbol of larger historical currents, of the growing power of universities, of the tensions between youth and authority, and of a society inching toward modern ideas of time. Yet even now, centuries later, one wonders what those long-gone students thought as they stared into the darkness after curfew. Did they dream of argument? Did they rehearse Latin conjugations in their minds? Or did they simply wish the candle had burned a bit longer? Unresolved thought. If the candle had burned longer, if students had studied deeper into the night without restriction, how might that have reshaped the ideas that came from these early centers of learning? In the shadowed halls of late medieval academia, a quiet battle simmered not over ideology, not over theology or empire, but over sleep. Specifically, when it should begin, who could control it, and what it meant for the serious business of scholarship. We left off with the flickering image of Jean Leblond, a Parisian student, watching his final candle melt to a stub. But Jean's complaint wasn't a solitary lament. Out across Europe, students were pushing back against curfews and restrictions, sometimes with quills and parchment, sometimes with fists and stones. To understand how deeply bedtime rules penetrated university life and how passionately they were resisted, we must look closer at the structures that enforced them and the increasingly creative ways students tried to get around them. The rulebooks. Of the learned by the late 14th century, major universities like Oxford, Paris, and Prague had codified sleep into their internal statutes. A student at Oxford in 1395 might have been handed a regular private or personal rulebook upon enrollment, outlining expectations: no shouting after sunset, no playing instruments in dormitories, and absolutely no use of candles after Compline without written approval. Students were fined for violations, sometimes as little as a halfpenny, sometimes more. Repeat offenders were subject to more severe punishments, copying religious texts by hand as penance, standing silent during meals, or even temporary expulsion. But the effectiveness of these rules hinged on enforcement. And here lay the great medieval contradiction. Though university rules were strict, the capacity to enforce them was often flimsy at best. Each college typically had a proctor, a faculty officer charged with discipline, and a small corps of bedels, porters, or watchmen. These men patrolled dormitory halls after curfew with oil lanterns in hand, checking for illicit light or sound. But students, clever and sleep-deprived, learned to subvert the system. Some carved small candle niches inside wooden trunks and propped the lids just high enough to let smoke escape. Others rigged ropes to lower candles beneath floorboards, retrieving them when the watchman passed. More daring students colluded with servants or younger scholars to act as lookouts during illegal nighttime reading sessions. In many respects, this mirrored broader European trends, a rule-based society held together by imperfect enforcement and a lot of looking the other way. When the scholars went on strike, of course, not all disobedience was subtle. The most famous resistance to bedtime rules came not from trickery, but open rebellion. The most notable case occurred in 1431 at the University of Vienna, where a group of theology students staged a candle strike. Upset by a new policy limiting night study to 90 minutes after sunset, the students refused to attend lectures or participate. In public disputations, their protest wasn't about comfort. It was about prestige. At the time, being seen as a diligent, tireless scholar was a matter of reputation. Students were expected to impress masters, debate in Latin with confidence, and memorize reams of Aristotelian philosophy. Losing evening study time risked intellectual humiliation. The university authorities responded with threats, sexpulsion, fines, and cancellation of upcoming examinations. But the students held firm, and support grew among the law and medicine faculties. For nearly a month, lectures stalled, and the university nearly shut down. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Study hours were extended, but only in supervised rooms under candle-monitoring watchmen. The rebellion had succeeded, but at the cost of greater institutional control. This pattern repeated itself throughout the century. Each time students pushed against curfew and lighting laws, they gained small concessions, longer hours, supervised halls, but also gave up autonomy in the process. The sleep debates, in theological terms, one might imagine university arguments over bedtime, as entirely secular, but in medieval Europe, everything had a theological dimension, including sleep. Scholars debated whether long sleep was a sign of slotha, deadly sonor, a necessary rest ordained by God. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, carefully distinguished between excessive sleep due to intemperance and rest taken in pursuit of virtue. The nuance wasn't lost on university faculty. Lectures on moral conduct often included references to the virtue of disciplined rest. Students were told that those who slept too little risked becoming confused or heretical. Yet they were also warned that indulgence and long sleep weakened the soul's resolve. This double standard: sleep too much and you're lazy, sleep too little and you're a danger to doctrine, placed students in an impossible position. Worth noting that the church itself took no uniform stance. Monasteries often expected monks to wake for prayers in the dead of night matins, only to return to sleep again. This fragmented sleep, sometimes called segmented sleep, was considered spiritually beneficial. Some historians believe university bedtimes reflected this monastic rhythm. Early sleep: a short waking period for midnight prayer or study, and a second sleep before dawn. But students rarely followed this ideal pattern. It's most like Jean LeBlond, simply stayed up as long as they could, chasing comprehension through candlelight. Economic pressure and bed rental. Another factor in the bedtime debate was economic and surprisingly literal. In many colleges, students did not have individual beds. Instead, beds were rented by the hour or shared in shifts. Baloney. It was common for 2 or even 3 scholars to share a single bed, especially in the lower faculties. Sleep was staggered. One student would study while the other slept. Then they'd switch at a prearranged time. The mattress was hard, the blanket thin, and privacy non-existent. This practice, known as rotation bedding, created informal rules around bedtime. Students negotiated with each other, sometimes bitterly, over who got first sleep. Those who needed to rise early for disputations might bargain for the first shift, while others preferred to study late and sleep into the morning. College authorities disliked the system, as it undermined their attempts at curfew enforcement. A student who claimed he couldn't sleep because his bedmate was still using the mattress is technically not in violation. In response, some colleges instituted fixed sleep rosters, essentially a posted schedule indicating who was to be asleep and when. But enforcement was weak, and resentment grew. Scholars who felt their study hours were being constrained by bed sharing or curfew. Rules began lobbying for dedicated study cells, small, private chambers with candle privileges. By the early 15th century, such cells became status symbols in wealthier colleges, reinforcing the growing class divide between students. Time, candle marks, and the birth of quiet hours by the mid-1400s. Universities began instituting a new solution to the bedtime dilemma: quiet hours. Rather than enforce strict curfews, colleges designated certain times for silence and reflection, effectively letting students decide whether to study or sleep. This shift coincided with the rise of more accurate timekeeping methods. The advent of mechanical clocks in universities allowed for the division of time into smaller, more precise segments known as candle marks, roughly the time it took a standard candle to burn down. At Merton College, Oxford, one of the first mechanical tower clocks was installed in the late 14th century. It rang bells at scheduled intervals, replacing the inconsistent hand-rung curfew system. With clocks came a more standardized approach to managing student life. Quiet hours were now defined down to the quarter hour, and rules were posted publicly. Interestingly, this new precision did not necessarily reduce student complaints. Instead, the debate shifted from whether curfew was necessary to exactly when it should begin. A quarter-hour discrepancy could mean finishing or abandoning an argument, translating or leaving untranslated an important sentence of Boethius or Aquinas. Even as enforcement improved, so too did student tactics. Secret ink notes were passed under doors. Footsteps were muffled by rags. Books were copied by moonlight, the Latin characters slightly askew from tired eyes and chilled fingers. A cultural divide, north versus south. Across Europe, different university regions treated bedtime rules differently. Northern schools like Paris, Oxford, and Colin tended to be stricter, favoring early curfews and cold monastic discipline. Southern universities like Bologna, Padua, and Salamanca were more lenient, perhaps influenced by warmer climates and more relaxed civic cultures. In these southern schools, night lectures were sometimes held outdoors, under torchlight or starlight, especially in summer. In Padua, student societies formed that promoted late-night readings and philosophical salons. Here, bedtime became more social than solitary. While still technically against the rules, these gatherings were often overlooked by faculties. Prominent scholars were in attendance. The southern schools seemed to understand that learning sometimes bloomed best under stars. Northern schools, by contrast, doubled down on structure, even instituting prayer patrols that walked dormitory halls and offered whispered devotions to sleepy scholars. It was a cultural divide, not just of policy, but of philosophy. Was learning a matter of discipline or inspiration? Did knowledge thrive in darkness or only in the light of day? Unresolved thought. If the rules of sleep and study had been shaped more by the southern spirit of Padua than the northern rigor of Oxford, our modern universities look and feel entirely different? By the late 15th century, Europe's great universities were no longer small. Monastic experiments tucked behind cloisters and city walls, they had grown physically, intellectually, and administratively. The sleepy halls once lit by trembling candlelight were now structured institutions with statutes, schedules, and sprawling faculties. But the battle over bedtime, it never really ended. It simply evolved. This third and final section explores the long-term consequences of the medieval university's obsession with controlling when students should sleep, study, and rise. It's a story of unintended influence, how something as dull as curfew policy contributed to the development of student rights, architectural design, academic time management, and the very rhythm of modern higher education. And perhaps most unexpectedly, how 1,000 years of arguing over lights out gave birth to the concept of academic freedom itself. A clock in every tower, the spread of mechanical clocks across European cities in the 14th and 15th centuries, didn't just transform commerce or civic life, it redefined the university day. Where time had once been measured by sun angle or the length of a burning candle, now it ticked with mechanical regularity. Oxford's tower clock, installed in the 1370s, rang the hours precisely. So did the bell of St. Severine in Paris and Bologna's great communal bell. The university day, once governed by imprecise bells, marking Compline or matins, became rigidly structured. Lectures began on the hour. Examinations started at the quarter hour. Silence was to fall precisely at 9 p.m., not shortly after sunset. This mechanization of time brought both order and anxiety. Students were now expected to conform to fixed blocks of time. Learning, once continuous and fluid, became a series of scheduled slots. It was efficient. It was predictable. But it also invited a new kind of rebellion, on against the idea of bedtime itself, but against the industrialization of the student's day. In this way, curfews and candles had given rise to clocks, and clocks had given rise to resistance. Dormitories, discipline, and the architecture of rest, the architecture of medieval universities, tells its own sleepy story. Originally, most students lodged in rented rooms or with local townspeople, often in loud, cramped quarters. But by the 15th century, dedicated college dormitories became more common. And these dormitories were designed with regulation in mind. At Cambridge's early colleges, dorm rooms were small, shared, situated along long corridors, easily patrolled by night watchmen. Windows were high and narrow, hard to sneak through. Doors creaked deliberately. Some dorms even had squint-steiny observation holes so bedels could see inside without knocking. Lighting was limited. Built-in candle niches were designed to allow only one small taper at a time. Chimneys were discouraged. Candles were counted. Why such a strict design? Because bedtime was viewed not just as a practical concern, but as a moral one. Students were believed to be most vulnerable to temptation in the dark, alone, after curfew. Excessive sleep was a sin. So too, perhaps, was sleeping too close to others. Architecture, then, became an extension of the rulebook walls that instructed, as much as they protected. But over time, students pushed back against this surveillance. In Bologna and Paris, private study cells were requested. In Krakow, students began petitioning for curtains or partitions. The logic was clear. In order to think freely, one had to rest freely too. The battle over bedtime became a question of space of where students could exist privately in a system. Built on public scrutiny, printed light, books that could burn the night. Then came a revolution that none of the bed checkers or curfew setters could have anticipated: the printing press. By the late 1400s, printed books began appearing in university towns. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't limited to a few hand-copied manuscripts guarded in college libraries. Students could buy or at least borrow texts of their own. With access to books came a new kind of night. Even without candles, students could read by moonlight, or later, by oil lamp. The printing press didn't just democratize information. It made bedtime rules harder to enforce. In response, some colleges banned the use of books after hours without a license. At the University of Leipzig, in 1491, students caught reading unapproved texts at night could be fined, even if the content wasn't heretical. The issue was when. They were reading, not what they were reading, but these efforts proved futile. The printed word was portable, replicable, and most dangerously for authority quiet. With books came solitude, and with solitude came thought that didn't need permission. For centuries, universities had tried to control when students should stop thinking. Now, the students no longer needed light or a license to do it. From curfew to academic freedom, the modern concept of academic freedom, the idea that scholars and students should be free to pursue inquiry without external control, seems far removed from debates over when to blow out a candle. But it's not. Medieval students, in resisting curfews, weren't just asking for more sleep or more study time. They were challenging the idea that knowledge could be scheduled. They were saying, my mind doesn't work on a timetable. It cannot. Think only between sunrise and sunset. This quiet resistance had an accumulative effect. By the 16th century, student petitions began to include broader demands: the right to study independently, to choose living quarters, and to pursue reading outside the official curriculum. These weren't always granted, but they became part of the conversation, in some sense. The spark of academic freedom came not from the lecture podium, but from the dormitory bed where young scholars lay awake, frustrated by the rules that told them when to stop learning. Bedtime today, the quiet echoes of the past. Today's universities seem worlds away from candlelit dormitories and quill-scribbled curfews, yet echoes of the bedtime debates remain. Modern college dorms have quiet hours. Student handbooks still reference room noise and appropriate times for study or rest. University libraries post signs reminding visitors to observe silence after 9 p.m. midnight study lounges. 24-hour reading rooms and late-night finals week exceptions all reflect the same historical tension. When does intellectual pursuit yield to institutional structure? Even debates around mental health and sleep hygiene in student life trace their lineage back to these early questions. How much sleep is too much? Can a well-rested student still be ambitious? Are academic schedules humane? We no longer patrol dorm halls with oil lanterns, but we still schedule thought. Lectures at 8 a.m., finals at 6 p.m., deadlines at midnight. The machinery of time, once managed by bells, now hums digitally through campus apps and calendar alerts. Yet the instinct remains. Some students still study best at 2 a.m. Some ideas still arrive only in the silence of the dark. Reflections. On the candle's end, in 1485, a scholar named Pietro of Ravenna wrote in his Phoenix, "There are truths that do not come with daylight, but rise only after long hours of vigil, when the world is asleep and the soul alone remains at its desk. His words capture something that all those medieval arguments over bedtime never quite resolved, that rest and learning do not sit neatly on opposite sides of the clock. They are interwoven. One restores, the other strains. And sometimes the best thinking comes not before or after sleep, but between its folds. The sleepy battles of Oxford, Paris, and Bologna didn't just illuminate a moment in educational history. They shaped the contours of intellectual freedom, the idea that you, the student, get to decide when and how you learn. And in this quiet rebellion against bedtime, we see a very human truth, that even in the dullest corners of history, even in the forgotten rulebooks and long extinguished candles, something enduring was lit. Final reflection. So the next time you find yourself awake late at night, reading or thinking, or simply unable to sleep, remember the long line of scholars who came before you, eyes tired, candles low, trying to think one sentence further than the rules allowed. It is a crisp spring morning in 1347, and the bells of Merton College are tolling their first note before the mist has lifted from the stone lanes of Oxford. A young student named Robert of Bampton bolts upright in his straw-stuffed bed, overslept, doesn't need to check the candle stub on the sill. He can tell by the rhythm of the bells. Secunda Lectio, the second lecture of the day, is already beginning. And worse, he has already missed Prima. His heart sinks. Not because he missed something fascinating, but because he may have just cost himself an entire term's credit. Because in medieval universities, attendance wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Absence, even from a single lecture, could lead to fines, punishments, or being barred from examinations. And more than once, tired scholars' failure to rise with the bell determined whether he graduated or didn't. The sleeping scholars. Dilemma: medieval universities functioned more like religious communities than modern schools. Modeled after monastic life, colleges scheduled their days according to the canonical hours. From matins at midnight to compline at sundown, every moment had a purpose, and every scholar was expected to conform. The lecture schedule was brutal. At Oxford in the 14th century, the first official lecture of the Dauphin in canon law, or logic, began before sunrise, usually around 5 o'clock or 6 a.m. in summer, slightly later in winter. Students were expected to gather in unheated stone lecture halls, with notebooks, candles, and their worn copies of Aristotle or Lombard's sentences. Those who arrived late might be let in, but their names would be written down. A second absence could bring a verbal rebuke, a third, a fine, a fourth, dismissal from the terms, course, or even expulsion from the college. For most students, failure to appear wasn't taken lightly, not even if you had a fever, not even if the snow was waist-deep on the road from the dormitory, certainly not if you simply overslept. The roll call and the roll book each lecture was monitored by a magistrate senior scholar, or doctorand, often a scribe. His sole job was to take attendance. The scribe used a roll book with students' names written by hand, usually in Latin. Each day during the first few minutes of lecture, names were called aloud. Students had to respond with adsum, I am here. Though those who didn't respond were marked absent with a specific symbol of an asterisk, dot, or inverted letter. In some cases, students hired a friend or a roommate to answer for them, especially if they were only running late. But if discovered, both students faced punishment. The impersonator could be fined. The absentee, suspended. At the University of Paris's attendance was so strictly monitored that students were expected to sign a separate attendance register at the door of certain public disputations. These logs were kept for years and reviewed before degrees were awarded. Even exams couldn't be taken without proof of consistent attendance. To earn a Bachelor of Arts degree, a student typically had to attend at least 2 full years of lectures, with no more than a handful of missed days, and these were not flexible semesters. Missing even a single required lecture could force a student to repeat an entire term. The tolling bell and the college watch in the age before alarm clocks, students relied on bells to know when to wake. Each college had a tower bell rung manually by a porter or watchman. These bells tolled to mark canonical hours, meal times, curfews, and most critically lectures. Students slept lightly, knowing that if they missed the prime bell they would miss the lecture. Some developed their own ways to wake on time, placing pebbles in their bed to jolt them awake or drinking large amounts of ale at night to ensure a sunrise bathroom break. Some even employed waker boys, younger students, or hired servants, who would rouse sleeping scholars in exchange for scraps of food or help with grammar lessons. These early alarm boys would knock on doors or throw small stones at windows. Still, students often overslept, especially those who had stayed up past curfew to study or simply to escape the structured monotony of regulated days. Punishments for tardiness varied by college. At Merton and Balliol, fines were added to a student's term bill. At Paris, students could be made to stand outside the classroom door for the duration of the lecture as public shame. At Cambridge, one memorable regulation stated that a student who is thrice tardy to the lecture of Master Roger shall lose his candle stipend, which meant no more college-funded candles for studying at night, sleep, attendance, and the medieval student's body behind. The enforcement of attendance was a deeper belief about the purpose of education and the role of discipline in shaping character. To attend lecture was not merely to learn, it was to obey. The medieval university was, in part, a place to form the moral self. Punctuality, silence, posture, and presence were not trivial, they were signs of worthiness. A sleepy student was a dangerous one, undisciplined, inattentive, and possibly heretical. In fact, sleeping during lecture could be punished even more harshly than missing it. At the University of Bologna, a student caught sleeping during a lecture on canon law could be made to recite the next lecture aloud, in Latin, to the rest of the class. In Paris, students who nodded off too often were moved to the front bench within the direct line of the magister's gaze. Some masters even kept rods or canes on hand not to strike students necessarily, but to bang on the podium loudly whenever heads began to droop. In this world, there was no, "I'm not a morning person." You woke with the bell, you showed up, you stayed awake, or you didn't belong. Who missed class and who could afford to, but not all students were treated equally. Wealthier students, sons of nobility, merchants, or clergy often, had more leeway. Some lived in private lodgings, far from the dorms. Others had tutors or paid scribes who could provide notes if they missed a lecture. Poorer students, by contrast, had little room for error. A single missed lecture might mean losing their college spot, forfeiting a bursary, or being reassigned to manual duties. Some colleges even required poor scholars to ring the bells themselves, or help stoke the fire in lecture halls, meaning they had to rise before the others. In such cases, missing lecture was doubly risky. It suggested not only laziness, but also ingratitude for charity. This inequality was rarely spoken aloud, but it echoed in every cold corridor and flickering candle. Attendance, like so much else, was shaped by class. The morning march and public shame arriving late was not a private failure, it was a public one. Colleges were tight spaces. Students walked together from dormitories to lecture halls, often in small processions. Being the last to leave one's chamber was noticed. Being the last to enter the hall, even more so. Some colleges even assigned dormitory monitors who recorded when students rose. At Queen's College, Oxford, morning reports were given to the provost, who read them aloud once a week. There are recorded instances where students were made to write Latin verses apologizing for lateness and then read them aloud at dinner. Attendance becomes protest over time. Some students began to resist these rigid expectations. With curfews, small acts of rebellion took root. In 1457, a group of Paris students staged what they called a late rising, a collective protest in which they all refused to appear at morning lecture, citing cold dormitories and lack of firewood. The university threatened suspension. The students responded by writing a satirical Latin poem about the absurdity of learning logic while one's toes were frozen. Eventually, firewood was provided. The rule was relaxed slightly. As with curfews, the battle was not about sleep alone, it was about control. Students were pushing back, not against learning, but against the idea that every breath, every blink of sleep must fit the university's bell. unresolved thought. If the university had trusted students to govern their own time too, rise when ready, to learn by their own rhythm, would modern education look more like a monastery or more like a cafe? It is the year 1309. A cold drizzle dampens the cobbled quadrangle of the University of Paris. Beneath the covered walkways of the Collège de Sorbonne, students shuffle quietly toward the lecture hall. Among them is a 17-year-old boy from Flanders named Jan. He's pale, shivering, and holding his swollen cheek. A toothache. It throbs with each heartbeat, hot and sharp. But Jan is more afraid of speaking than of pain. For if he utters a single word in Flemish, even to ask for balm or mercy, he risks a fine, or worse, public chastisement before his peers. Because within the walls of this university, only Latin may be spoken. At lectures and disputations, in prayer, and sometimes even when crying.
Ow.
The language of the learned Latin wasn't just a subject at medieval universities. It was the medium through which knowledge flowed, the currency of thought, and the key to being taken seriously. In the 13th and 14th centuries, if you wished to learn theology, philosophy, law, or medicine, you had to speak Latana, not clumsily either. You had to speak it fluently, correctly, and above all, constantly. This was not only a tradition, it was a requirement. Nearly every university in Europe, from Paris to Padua and Oxford to Prague, imposed strict language policies. These were written into college statutes. They didn't simply suggest Latin, they forbade vernacular languages entirely. At the University of Bologna, a student caught speaking in Italian was fined 1 denarius for every word. At Oxford, the rule read plainly: nullus loquatur Anglici intra collegium. No one shall speak English within the college. And if a student was heard complaining about the rules in French, English, Dutch, or German, they might be made to recite a passage from Cicero aloud in perfect declension, while others listened in judgment. Latin was law. Why so strict? It's tempting to think of these language rules as pretentious ivory, tower gatekeeping. But the logic, however rigid, was practical. Latin was the only universal academic language in medieval Europe. A student from Spain could debate a scholar from Bohemia Efand only if they both spoke Latin. Universities were melting pots. A single classroom might contain students from 10 or more regions: England, Normandy, Flanders, Saxony, Lombardy, and Galicia. No single vernacular would serve. But Latin was the glue. More than that, Latin was the language of precision. It allowed for complex argument, theological nuance, and subtle logic. In philosophy, a misplaced noun declension could unravel an entire proposition. In theology, the wrong tense might border on heresy. Latin was also the language of books. Manuscripts, legal texts, and biblical commentaries, nearly all were written in Latin. To learn was to read. To read was to understand Latin. And so, from the moment a student entered the university, they were expected to abandon the tongue of their childhood and adopt the tongue of empire and church. The first lesson: speak like a scholar or not. And all new students often began their studies with a short crash course in Latin grammar, kind of linguistic boot camp. These were grueling affairs. Students memorized declensions, conjugations, and vocabulary lists by rote. They were made to recite verb forms while standing on stools and punished for hesitation or error. With small slaps or public correction, these drills were often done before sunrise, in unheated rooms. A student might stammer through AMO, AMAs, AMO, while shivering from both cold and nerves. Once inducted, students were expected to maintain the illusion that Latin came as naturally as breath. It didn't. Many spoke in halting phrases. Others resorted to Latin-French hybrids or English-Latin, slang known mockingly as dog Latin. Still, the rule held firm. If you wanted to be a scholar, you had to sound like one. And sounding like one meant never speaking as yourself. Latin, in daily life, the tongue of sleep, sickness, and silence, the rule of Latin extended beyond the classroom. In the dormitories of Paris and Oxford, Students were expected to converse in Latin even after hours. Meal halls had language monitors often. Senior students or college officers who find anyone caught speaking in vernacular. If a student stubbed their toe, they were to exclaim "Hew," not "ouch." They asked to pass the ale jug, they said, "Da mihi pocolum servicia." And if they had a toothache like young Jana Flanders, they had to request aid in the same scholarly tongue, Domini, dolio, dentum, meum, not meon, tandoet pine. Failure to comply marked you as ignorant, possibly uncouth, certainly unfit for higher thought. Some students became skilled at pantomime gesturing, pointing and miming their needs rather than risk speaking their native language. Others simply stayed quiet. In this way, Latin became a kind of wall. It separated student from student, thought from instinct, and sometimes painfully identity from voice. The mental toll of constant translation, the effort required to live in Latin was immense. Students not only had to learn new ideas, they had to translate their own thoughts before they could speak. Imagine waking from a dream and needing to rehearse a declension before telling your roommate about it. Imagine trying to explain your homesickness, or a fear of hell, or a memory of your mother in a tongue that carried none of your emotional memory. The mental strain was real. Many students reported sleep disruption, difficulty expressing themselves, and a sense of isolation in their first year. Some dropped out. Others developed coping strategies, secret conversations after curfew, writing letters home in their native tongue, forming cliques based on shared dialects, Flemish with Flemish Gascons. But even these groups policed themselves, speaking French or English to freely risk being overheard. And a report to the college master could result in a warning or worse, a letter to one's sponsor or father. So students learned to live within two languages, one for thought, the other for feeling, one for waking life, the other for dreams. The exceptions, laughter and nightmares, of course. The rule of Latin wasn't airtight. Students laughed in their own languages. Jokes rarely worked in Latin. A pun about a poorly cooked fish, or a mockery of a teacher's baldness worked better in one's mother tongue. At night in the dormitories, you could sometimes hear students whispering in English or Breton, especially when homesick. These whispers were short, urgent, and usually accompanied by nervous giggles or glances at the door. And in sleep, language broke down entirely. It was not uncommon to hear students crying out in dreams in their native tongue. Mamang or Feder, help me, rang out in the dorm halls. The next morning, nothing would be said. A few glances, a smirk, but no punishment. Because the university controlled your waking words, not the ones you uttered in the dark. The gradual death of the Latin wall by the late 15th century, change was stirring. The rise of printed books, growing literacy in local languages, and the influence of humanism slowly weakened Latin's monopoly. Grammar schools still taught Latin, but vernacular texts like Chaucer in English or Dante in Italian began appearing in academic circles. Some professors even allowed students to translate their theses into local languages for sponsors or patrons. Still, Latin remained the default for centuries more. At the University of Salamanca, lectures were in Latin well into the 1700s. At Oxford, final exams were held in Latin until 1854. It had started as a tool of unity. It ended as a ritual of tradition. And along the way, countless students whispered their pain, their confusion, and their homesickness in languages the university refused to hear. Final reflection. What would it have meant for those students lonely, ill, or simply tired, to speak in the voice of their childhoods? Could knowledge have grown stronger, not weaker, if it had listened to more than one tongue? It was a low, heavy sound, drawn out by a groggy porter pulling on a thick rope in the dark. It echoed through narrow cloisters and under stone archways, bouncing against shuttered dormitory windows. For most students, it was not a welcome sound. This was the horologium, the time bell. The day's beginning was not decided by the sky, nor by the inner rhythms of the body. It was chosen by the masters, by custom, and above all, by the clock. But in the early 14th century, a clock was not what you imagine. There were no glowing faces, no ticking hands. There was no wristwatch to consult discreetly under your robe. There was only the slow grind of monastery gears, the stiff shadows of candle clocks, and the anxious watch for bells that rang by rope and muscle. And yet, in these unwieldy contraptions and crude systems, lay total control over a student's life. Time was not neutral. Time was discipline. For the clock. Time by candle and shadow at the earliest universities, like Bologna and Paris. In the 12th century, time was measured the way monasteries had always measured it, with light, bells, and routine. The most common method was the candle clock. A thick beeswax candle, often marked in hourly notches, would burn at a predictable rate. Each notch equaled a quarter hour or half hour, depending on the candle's width. Monks and students alike would light the candle and monitor its progress through lessons, readings, or debates. In winter, the candle was both timekeeper and heat source. In summer, it was one more sweating inconvenience. By the 13th century, water clocks also made appearances, wide bowls that dripped water steadily into smaller basins. With lines etched inside to track the passing hours, some were even rigged with a floating piece of wood attached to a small bell that rang when the hour passed. But these methods were imperfect. Candles flickered in the wind. Water froze or overflowed. The passage of time, though constant, was messy, erratic, and open to interpretation. Still, students were punished for arriving late, even if the clock itself disagreed with the sun. Enter the mechanical clock, precision with teeth in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Mechanical clocks began appearing in European cities. The first such devices were large, crude, and wildly expensive. Oxford's earliest clock is thought to have been built around 1336 in the bell tower of New College. Paris followed soon after. These clocks used weights, gears, and escapements, new mechanical innovations that turned potential energy into reliable tick-tick motion. At first, they had no dials-only bells. The clock struck the hour, and that was it. But that sound changed everything. It rang without bias, without delay. Couldn't be pleaded with. Now, students who once bargained minutes from a candle's edge had a new master one that measured time in iron and rope. The bell becomes a whip. It wasn't long before the sound of the bell came to rule the entire university schedule. Matins bell, time to rise. Lecture bell, time to learn. Dinner bell, time to eat in silence. Disputation bell, time to argue. Compline bell, time to sleep. Curfew bell, time to return to your quarters or face a fine. Each toll signaled a precise expectation. Each delay, even by minutes, was marked as disobedience. At some colleges, students were forbidden from using any other timekeeping method. Sundials were banned. Personal candles were frowned upon unless used strictly for reading. Timekeeping was a centralized authority, and only the clockkeeper and college master held its keys. Students were now tethered to a schedule they could not control and could not question. Clock watchers and timekeepers, of course, the clock had to be maintained. In large colleges like Merton and Magdalen, a special servant or horologer was appointed. This man, sometimes a student working in exchange for tuition, was responsible for winding the weights daily, checking the gears, and ensuring that the bell rang on time. If the bell was late or early, complaints poured in often from masters, whose lectures relied on absolute precision. Students learned to live by the bell, developing an internal sensitivity to its patterns. Some reported phantom bells hearing a ring that hadn't yet sounded, simply because their bodies expected it. This deep internalization of the bell was part of the system's power. It created a sense of guilt, not only for disobedience, but also for delay, even imagined. Time had become moral. Time as punishment, but time was also used to punish. A student who broke curfew might be forced to wake before the first bell for a week assigned to sweep dormitory halls or clean out privies before dawn. Another might be barred from dinner, forced to wait a full hour after the bell before receiving a cold crust and cup of sour ale. Some were locked in the thinking cell, a small study chamber with no clock or bellware time passed unnoticed. A kind of sensory isolation. a medieval timeout. One of the more common punishments was being assigned bell watch, the tedious job of standing in the tower and ringing the hour manually if the clock failed. This could last all night and was often used to punish students who skipped morning. Lecture. There, in the dark, the student stood, hand on rope, listening for nothing, waiting for time. A curious resistance. Despite the rigidity, students found ways to resist. Some mischief makers learned to muffle the bells tying leather strips around the clappers so the chimes were softened or missed entirely. This would cause mass confusion and occasionally lead to a free morning for everyone. Others bribed the clock keeper to delay the morning bell, allowing an extra quarter hour of sleep. It rarely worked twice. Still others faked time itself scratching. False notches into candles or dripping water into water clocks early to simulate progress. But these were desperate and often foolish acts. Time, once mechanical, left little room for negotiation. Legacy of the medieval clock. The great irony of the cloister clock is that it was invented to free monks and scholars from uncertainty, to mark the hours for prayer and study, to make life smoother. But as with all tools, it became a chain. And yet, it worked. Students awoke. Students gathered. Students marched half asleep to their places and listened to lectures on grammar, logic, and theology, often in biting cold, on empty stomachs, and with heads still full of dreams. The clock kept order. The clock kept pace. And slowly, it kept the soul in line. Final reflection. Was it time that ruled the scholar, or the fear of what happened if time was ignored? And if a student had been allowed to drift free from bells and notches and clappers, would he'd still have learned? Or perhaps learned more. The curfew bell had rung. The sound echoed like a lid closing over the day. Students were expected to extinguish their candles, retire to their shared dormitories, and speak no more than whispers until the next morning's bell. But tonight, behind a half-closed door on the top floor of the college's west wing, the faint sound of parchment turning could still be heard. And below that, a hushed voices speaking in Latin, cautiously, rapidly, and with a nervous energy that betrayed excitement. They had gathered again. 4 of them this time. In their laps, books that were not part of the prescribed syllabus, commentaries. That had not been approved by the magister. One of them, even horrible dictua translation of Averroes, the Muslim philosopher from Al-Andalus. They weren't gaming, they weren't drinking, they were disputing philosophy. At night without permission, it was strictly speaking forbidden. What was a disputation? Medieval universities. A disputation was a formal academic exercise, a kind of debate. Students were given a question: can the soul exist apart from the body, or is eternal law the same as natural law? And then required to argue for and against the proposition using logic, theology, and reference to authoritative texts. These weren't casual chats. They followed precise formats: the objections, the sed contra, the responsio, and the replies to objections. Students would practice for weeks, sometimes reciting parts from memory, in front of peers and masters. In a world without exams or grades, disputations were everything. They were how a student was judged, promoted, or dismissed. But they were always supervised, always during the day, always with approved topics and safe texts. Yet as the 14th century progressed, a quiet shift began. Some students, eager, curious, or just a little defiant, began holding private, unauthorized disputations after hours. Not because they wanted trouble, because they wanted more. What couldn't be debated despite the image of medieval universities as havens of thought, there were many things a student could not safely discuss. Questions of cosmology, like whether the universe was eternal, could be deemed heretical. Criticisms of church doctrine were outright banned. Even innocent ideas, if they hinted at forbidden theology, could get a student excommunicated or worse, handed over to civil authorities. One famous example was the case of John of Jandun, a scholar associated with the radical interpretation of Aristotle. His work raised eyebrows when students began privately copying and discussing it outside lecture hours. It wasn't that the university hated thinking. was that it feared what unregulated thought might lead to. The candlelight rebels, so students gathered secretly, shared chambers, behind curtain partitions, or in outdo-views lecture rooms, where the draft could be tolerated in exchange for privacy. These little groups read and argued and whispered long into the night. They brought forbidden text copies made by hand, smuggled in through clerics or merchants from France, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire. They read works translated from Greek or Arabic, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, and even ancient poets. One would pose a question, and the others would take sides. The format was followed loosely, but the spirit was the same. Challenge, respond, refine, reflect. They debated not just abstract philosophy, but dangerous hypotheticals. What if Aristotle was right and the universe had no beginning? Could a person be virtuous without religion? Would a society ruled by reason be better than one ruled by faith? These weren't just intellectual exercises. They were thought experiments that tested the boundaries of belief, doctrine, and scholastic conformity. Risk and ritual. The risks of being caught were real. Each college employed porters, bedell clerks, or prefects who patrolled the halls at night. Unauthorized gatherings were against regulation, especially if they involved candle use considered. A fire hazard. A student caught studying after hours could be punished with fines, suspension of candle privileges, or public reprimand. A second offense might mean losing a bursary or being sent home for the term. To avoid detection, students developed rituals. They wrapped door handles with cloth to muffle the latch. They wedged books into window cracks to block flickering light. From betraying their presence, one student stood watch by the corridor coughing once if someone approached. Despite the risk, the tradition grew. Some scholars would later look back on these secret gatherings as their true education at a time when learning was not imposed, but chosen. What they talked about, though, the topics varied. Some favorites emerged. The double truth doctrine: could something be philosophically true, but theologically false? A question that got many into trouble. Determinism versus free will of. God knows all things. Do humans truly have freedom? The nature of the soul, is it immortal by reason or only by faith? Politics: could a non-Christian ruler be just? Could a tyrant be deposed by citizens? They also questioned the university itself. Was the rigid structure of lectures, fines, and bells truly designed to foster knowledge? Or was it simply a mirror of the monasteries, designed to produce obedience more than insight? These weren't idle musings. Some students would take these questions into their later writings, becoming reformers, radicals, or heretics. Never published, never lectured, never told anyone about the candlelight nights. The masters found out eventually. Some masters did learn of the secret disputations. Responses varied. Some turned a blind eye, so long as heretical texts weren't involved. They, too, had once been students. They remembered the hunger to know more. Others cracked down fiercely. One record from Cambridge notes a group of students fined for holding a nocturnal discussion on natural philosophy. They had quoted Aristotle too freely and used a copy of Boethius, not approved by the college. The leader was removed from the college register for the term. But the gatherings didn't stop. They became more cautious, more secret, and more determined. A legacy in shadow centuries later, when formal degrees expanded and Renaissance humanism took hold. Many of the questions first whispered in those secret disputations became topics of mainstream lectures. The old boundaries relaxed. The forbidden became formal. Philosophy stretched its legs. But the tradition of quiet, unsanctioned discussion never died. Even today, in student apartments, cafes, and late-night forums, the spirit of the candlelit disputation lives in the urge to question, the thrill of risky thinking, and the stubborn joy of learning in defiance of the clock. Final reflection: was the university's greatest gift its curriculum, more the courage it stirred in those who chose to learn outside of it? And what ideas might have bloomed had every whispered question been allowed to burn in the light? The robe was long, heavy, lined with wool. Its sleeves, wide and square, dangled past the wrists like curtains. It swept along the cold flagstones of the cloister and made a soft whispering sound when a student walked quickly, which, most of the time, he did not. It wasn't exactly flattering, yet no one questioned it. The robe the habitus clericalis was more than a garment. It was a symbol of discipline, humility, identity, and submission. Wearing it marked the student as a member of a great chain of knowledge stretching back to Rome and forward to salvation. And it also made it possible to sneak a goose pie into the dormitory undetected. Because, like everything in the medieval university, the robe came with rules. And where there are rules, there are workarounds. How the robe became mandatory: medieval students weren't technically le people upon enrolling in a university. A student became part of the clerical estate, ordained as a priest, but placed under the church's legal and moral jurisdiction. This came with certain benefits like immunity from secular courts, and certain expectations, chief among them, dress like a cleric. That meant long robes, often black or dark brown, modeled after monastic attire. The material varied by college and wealth. Wealthier students could afford wool blends or imported cloth. Poorer ones wore scratchier, simpler weaves. But all were expected to look, walk, and carry themselves in a way that reflected the solemnity of learning, even if they were just sneaking out to the latrine. Robes were for more than looks. The robes were not ornamental, were thought to shape the mind. Long sleeves discouraged hand gestures seen as a sign of emotional excess. The weight of the fabric imposed stillness. The drape and silhouette promoted a sense of uniformity, discouraging vanity or distinction. Robes served as discipline made visible. They reminded students they were not in the world but apart from it. There were rules about how to wear them. Sleeves must not be pinned or rolled up. The robe must be fastened while walking, not left open to show one's tunic. Robes must not be shortened, even in summer. Hoods must not be used unless it is raining. And most importantly, no ornamentation, no colored trim, no embroidered initials, and absolutely no bright linings. A student at Oxford in 1374 was fined for having scarlet lining inside his cuffs. He claimed it was a gift from his aunt. The court was unmoved. The pie problem, all of this created an unintended side effect. The robes were perfect for smuggling. The long, loose sleeves could carry extra apples from the dining hall. The wide fold at the back, called the lyra pipe, could conceal a flask of cheap wine. The inner lining could hold a sliver of bacon, a piece of bread, or in one legendary instance from Cambridge, an entire meat pie. This last case became a cautionary tale. In 1421, a student named Thomas Grafton was caught returning to his quarters with a suspiciously lumpy silhouette. A beadle stopped him and asked for an inspection. Inside the folds of his robe were one cold mutton pie, a half-wheel of cheese to apples and, inexplicably, a roll of parchment listing Latin verbs. Grafton was fined and made to write an essay in verse about the dangers of gluttony and pride. But the real punishment came from his fellows. They laughed so hard the story survived in marginalia for years. From then on, the act of smuggling food in one's robe was called graftoning. Quietly, out of earshot of masters. Beyond food, other uses and abuses of the robe, food wasn't the only thing hidden in robes. Dice gambling was banned, but games continued. Robes provided ample space to tuck away small carved dice, or marked tokens. Books, forbidden texts, small scrolls, or copied notes could be hidden in the inner folds and brought to unauthorized study sessions, love letters. A folded robe corner could conceal a note to a laundress, chambermaid, or even a fellow student. The university was no less romantic for being celibate. Slingshots. Some students weaponized their boredom. Slings, pebbles, and even miniature crossbows have been found hidden in abandoned robes. It's mostly used to torment pigeons, though sometimes each other. These subversions didn't go unnoticed. Masters began inspecting robes before formal disputations, or processions. Some colleges required robes to be left in the hall when entering private examinations. Still, students found new hiding spots. The robe was both a uniform and a secret passage. What happened if you refused the robe occasionally? A student resisted. Perhaps he found the robe too hot. It's itchy. It's a symbolic. Or perhaps he was simply tired of looking like every other half-starved theology scholar in Europe, refusing to wear the robe was not taken lightly. At Paris, a student appearing at lecture without a robe and hood was not allowed to enter. Oxford, the penalty was a public apology and a fine of fourpence, a sum that could buy 2 days' worth of bread and beer. In 1359, a student at Bologna wrote in his journal that he wished to study in his linen under tunic on warm days but did not dare. To be bare of robe, he wrote, is to be bare of status, because the robe wasn't just clothing. It was membership. The robe as public identity students were recognized by their robes outside university walls too. When walking through town, they were expected to maintain decorum, heads bowed, voices soft, posture upright. The robe marked them as scholars and therefore under clerical law, but not everyone respected it. In many towns, especially in France and Italy, tensions simmered between town and gown. Local citizens resented the special treatment. Students received their legal immunity, their loud behavior, and their poverty disguised as virtue. Fights broke out. Robes were grabbed, yanked, or used as flags in protests. One account from Paris describes a mob of bakers chasing a group of students who had criticized their bread prices. The students were pulled by their robes, their sleeves, torn, and one was thrown into a rain barrel. The robe could protect, but it could also make you a target. Changing the dress code over the centuries, student attire evolved. Colors were introduced to distinguish ranks, black for undergraduates and red or blue for masters. Trim began to appear in small, sanctioned amounts. Sleeves shortened, capes were added, mortarboards appeared. But the spirit of the original robe lingered. Even today, the modern academic gown worn at graduations and ceremonies traces its origin to these medieval garments. Heavy, long-sleeved, slightly impractical, and deeply symbolic. A reminder that to learn was to wear a uniform of humility, and occasionally a smuggled meat pie. Final reflection. Did the robe teach obedience or simply teach students how? To bend rules while looking obedient. When they finally removed it, did they miss the weight, tore only the warmth? Not loudly but enough. Just a dry scrape of old iron against stone. And already the monk at the scriptorium desk had raised his eyes. A student stepped through the heavy door, wool cloak damp with the morning mist, boots carefully wiped. His eyes scanned the dim space ahead. Shelves lined the walls, though not in the way you might imagine. These were not rows of books, but of book chains, thick iron links fastening each precious volume to its designated desk. The chains jingled softly when moved, like wind chimes heard through stone. He walked forward, nodding a silent apology for the noise. The university library had rules. So many rules. Some were written in thick Gothic script and nailed to the wall. Others were whispered, enforced by cold glances and sharper pens. But perhaps the unspoken rule was this: do not disturb the silence. Because in the Middle Ages, libraries were more than quiet places. They were sanctified spaces. And a single misplaced cough, sneeze, or ink blot could mean fines, punishment, or, at Oxford in the 14th century, excommunication. The medieval library wasn't for browsing in our modern. Imagination libraries are warm havens of shelves and soft chairs. You walk in, browse, choose, and read. Not so in medieval times. Most university libraries like those at Paris, Oxford, and Bologna functioned more like archives or scriptoria. Books were not for casual use, and many were not allowed to leave the room. That's because they were handmade. Painfully expensive, irreplaceable. A single book might require an entire year to produce. Parchment made from hundreds of animal skins. Ink imported from distant markets. Each letter is drawn by hand. Some volumes were so heavy, it took 2 people to move them, so students couldn't just pick them up and read. Instead, each book was chained to its lectern, attached by a long iron link. You read standing or perched on a wooden bench, flipping the pages slowly, your neck craning toward the dim window light or the flicker of a sanctioned candle. You were watched, usually by a monk or custos, librarum, the keeper of books. He kept a list of who entered, and he noticed everything. Rules. Upon rules, libraries posted rules on wood tablets or parchment scrolls near the entrance. Some examples included no talking. All conversation was forbidden, even in Latin whispers. No candles without permission. Fire was a constant fear. Unauthorized flames were fined or reported. No touching the chains unless reading the attached. Book. No wet clothing, as it could dampen the wooden desks or drip on vellum. No sneezing if it could be helped. And if not, one must turn away and cover the mouth with cloth. In some cases, students were required to wash their hands with vinegar water before entering to reduce the oils on their skin. At Cambridge, it was recorded that a student who left a thumb's print upon the margin of St. Gregory's homilies was denied access for a full term. At Paris, one college implemented silent bells. If a student needed assistance, he was to raise a wooden paddle painted with a symbol instead of speaking. This wasn't just about reverence, it was about preservation. Born of scarcity, every book was a treasure, and every reader a risk. The fear of theft. One of the greatest library fears was theft, because books were portable, valuable, and impossible to trace. Some students or outsiders occasionally tried to smuggle one out under their robes. In response, colleges developed elaborate security. Chained books, of course, custom book plates, with Latin inscriptions invoking curses upon thieves, written oaths, signed before being allowed to read certain volumes. One famous inscription read, "If anyone should steal or secretly remove this book, let him be excommunicated. Let him die the death. Let him be roasted in the fires of hell with pitch and brimstone." It was not just dramatic, it was real. In some cases, ecclesiastical authorities did excommunicate students who were caught defacing, stealing, or even mishandling books. To defile a book was to defile the word, and in a time when many texts were theological in nature, that was no small offense. The reading experience itself, reading in a medieval university library, was not a relaxed experience. The student stood, hunched over a sloped wooden desk, holding a heavy book flat with one hand, perhaps holding a stylus or scrap of parchment in the other. There were no bookmarks, no page numbers. Margins were wide and often already filled with older students' glosses and notes. Students didn't read for fun. They read to survive, to memorize theology, canon law, logic, and grammar. Reading was slow, laborious, sometimes painful. The windows were small, the air thick with dust and animal glue scent. Winter it was cold enough that ink would freeze mid-script. In summer it was stifling, but they endured. Because this was the center of knowledge, and even the smallest idea gleaned from the third sentence on the 17th page of Gratian's Decretum might be what helped you pass your disputation, or avoid public failure. Copying, not borrowing. If a student wanted to study a book more thoroughly, he didn't take it home, he copied it. In a side room of the library, or in a scriptorium across the college yard, he would sit for hours copying word by word onto scraps of parchment or reused scrolls. Some students shared the labor, each copying a section and then combining their notes, but copying was dangerous. A single miswritten word in a theological text could change the meaning completely and be flagged as heretical. One recorded example tells of a student who mistranslated caritas charity as carnitas fleshiness in a passage from St. Jerome. His professor returned the parchment with a single note. Heretic or glutton? Decide. A cough in the wrong moment. Because of all this solemnity, students became highly attuned to the quiet of the library. A sudden sneeze or cough shattered the stillness like a dropped chalice. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. A monk might slowly rise. And depending on the mood of the custodian, the offender could be asked to leave for the day. Fined a few pence if it was the second or third offense, or if the sneeze caused visible damage to an open book, ported to the dean in one curious Oxford case from the early 1400s. A student was expelled from the reading hall for an excessive wet sneeze that left a damp smear on the Psalter of St. Hugh, he protested. The record ends with the words, "He was not allowed to return until the book was dried and reblessed." The quiet between words, but there was beauty too. In the stillness, a rhythm emerged. The creak of a chain, the turn of parchment, the scrape of a stool, the distant toll of a college bell. Reading became a kind of ritual meditation performed, slowly, faithfully. It wasn't about speed, it was about absorption, mastery, contemplation. The library was not a place to visit, it was a place to enter like a cloister or a chapel. And students, even those who coughed, understood they were part of something larger than themselves, a tradition, a chain of memory, a world held together not just by parchment but by silence. Final reflection was it the knowledge itself that shaped the scholar or the reverence with which it was handled? And if a sneeze could shatter the sanctity of learning, how fragile was the wisdom that waited between the pages? Cold in winter, damp in spring, cracked with age, you could sometimes see your breath at night. There was one small window, glazed, only in richer colleges. Otherwise, it was open to the elements covered with oiled parchment if you were lucky. In the corner stood a low wooden bed, one mattress, one blanket, 2 students. This was not unusual. In fact, at Oxford in 1381, it was the norm. Most students didn't have their own rooms, or even their own beds. They shared everything: space, heat, noise, light, and smells. And eventually, even the most scholarly minds had to ask the practical question: how do 2 overworked, underslept, book-laden students survive in the same 12 feet of space without violence? The answer came in the form of something historians now call the roommate charter. It was never an official document, not posted on the college wall or preserved in the university statutes, but versions of it survive in marginalia, diaries, and personal letters. And while it was rarely written in full, it governed everything about student cohabitation. From candle usage to chamber pot rights, the shared beds were expensive. A full straw mattress could cost a student several weeks' allowance. Students couldn't afford one alone, so they shared. The bed was small by modern standards, about 4 feet wide. It's not much bigger than a cot. It had a straw mattress often infested with lice, a wool blanket itchy, sometimes damp, and a linen. Cover washed monthly? Maybe? The charter made clear rules: no rolling past the middle seam. Each student kept to his half. No hogging the blanket. Any blanket pulling was to be settled with a single tug. Repeated offenses led to arbitration. No elbows in the back, even if someone snored. Flatulence was expected but not to be weaponized. Snoring, for example, was tolerated, but chronic offenders could be forced to sleep at the foot of the bed. In extreme cases, they were made to sleep under the bed. A small pillow might be shared. And if one got up early, the other was not to be jostled. One marginal note reads, "Thomas kicked me in the shin as I rose for matins. I shall, in return, remove his candle wax tonight." The schedule candles were precious. Each student received a weekly ration, usually 1 thick taper or 2 smaller beeswax sticks. These had to last for both study and hygiene. And so a typical chamber had only 1 candle burning at a time, shared by both roommates. The charter settled flame. Disputes. If one student needed the candle to read and the other to sleep, reading took priority, but only until the Compline bell. If both needed it to read, the candle was to be moved halfway between them. No candle was to be left burning unattended. Punishment: loss of wax rations. Dropping wax on shared books was a punishable offense. So was scraping off your roommates' wax and reusing it. Sometimes candles were measured in notches. Students would score the candle to track usage. If one burned too far past his mark, he owed the other a portion of next week's wick. In wealthier rooms, students kept a tally, slate to track whose turn it was to light first. The chamber pot clause: there was usually 1 pot per room. It was placed beneath the bed or in a dark corner. In the morning or after it filled, it had to be emptied into a communal pit or privy, usually located outdoors and often shared. By the entire college, the charter outlined pot duties rotating daily, no exceptions. Whoever filled it last had to carry it tevin, if not by volume. No use during study hours. The odor was disruptive. No food storage near the pot. If the pot cracked, both were responsible. If it spilled, the cleaner owed the other a loaf of bread and one full apology. Some students tried to negotiate a chamber pot truce. If one handled cleaning, the other did laundry? But these were unstable arrangements and often ended in disputes. One recorded complaint reads, "John refuses to empty the pot unless I promise to forego cheese this week. I consider this extortion." Morning routines and noise etiquette, there were no showers, no coffee, and very little privacy. Most students rose with the bell or earlier if punished. But routines clashed, especially during exam season. So the charter stated, if one rose early, he must not hum, chant, or recite aloud until his roommate stirred. Boots must be tied softly. Water splashing was to be kept to the wash basin. No shaving in the sleeping corner. If one snored late into the morning, the other was allowed a single poke with the wax stick. No singing Gregorian hymns before sunrise. In extreme conflicts, a mediator, often the chamber porter, would be summoned. Some colleges had a student harmony officer unofficial, usually older students, to resolve these tensions. The laundry dilemma: underwear was rare, robes were shared, bedding was minimal. Washing happened monthly if at all, the charter recognized. This and advised robes may not be aired on the bed frame if another person is in the bed. Lice combs must not be shared. Soap use was encouraged but not mandated. If a roommate scratched excessively, he must inform the other. And in a line copied from several sources, "Let no man wash his small clothes in the drinking basin." That rule was often ignored. Emotional clauses, some roommate charters, preserved in letters or dorm walls, included emotional guidelines. No loud sighing when one fails a disputation. Comforting a crying roommate is noble, but optional. Do not read each other's marginalia without consent. If one receives a letter from home, the other must not press for reading. One letter from a student at Paris in 1389 ends, "If thou art sorrowful, I shall not mock thee. But if thou sing again after midnight, I shall place frogs in thy robe." The charter was not just a joke, though some clauses seem humorous. Many were taken seriously. Living in close proximity under constant academic pressure, sharing a bed, a candle, and a chamber patch required structure, students recognized this. So they negotiated rules not just out of practicality, but survival. These charters prefigured student unions, housing codes, and roommate agreements centuries before those became institutionalized. They were handcrafted systems of order in the small, flickering world of a medieval student cell. At first glance, it looked like part of the regalia, something ceremonial. A rod, usually carved from ash or yew, about the length of an arm, polished smooth by decades of use. Its surface might be etched with simple bands or notches or left plain. It was known by many names: the baculus, the teaching staff, the discipline rod, but among students, it was simply called the stick. And professors didn't just carry it for show. They tapped it against the lectern to bring silence, pointed it at sleepy scholars to demand recitation, used it to guide the eye along a line of text, and on rare occasions, they used it to strike. It's not out of cruelty necessarily, but because the medieval classroom was not always a place of calm or quiet, the stick served as a visible reminder of order, hierarchy, and authority. Professors as clerics and judges in the medieval university, the professor wasn't a teacher. In the modern sense, he was usually a clericophan, a priest or monk who had studied longer, read more, and been granted the right to lecture by the faculty or bishop. He was called magister, lector, or doctor. He sat at an elevated cathedral, a teaching chair, and students gathered below him on benches, stone ledges, or wooden planks. It was crowded. It was loud. The average lecture might have 50 to 100 students in a single vaulted hall, many of them bored, hungry, or half asleep. So the professor needed tools. He had his book, his notes, his voice, and his stick. The stick is a teaching tool. The first and most common use of the stick was to command attention. When students murmured, the professor would rap the stick on the wood of the lectern once, twice, sharply. To emphasize a point, he'd raise it in the air or circle it slowly above his head. To indicate a specific line of text, he might lean forward and tap the parchment. During disputations, he would point at students with the stick to summon them to speak. The stick became part of the visual grammar of the classroom. It signaled rhythm, structure, even mood. Some students joke that one could follow a lecture without hearing it just by watching how the stick moved. Discipline and correction, but the stick was not just symbolic. There are numerous records scattered across university statutes, letters and complaints describing professors who used the stick more physically. A student who snored during a logic lecture might receive a gentle thwack on the shoulder. One who openly passed notes or whispered might be tapped, then smacked on the back. A chronic latecomer might be made to stand while the professor pointed at him silently with the rod for several minutes. These acts were called corrections, meant not to humiliate, but to realign. In the 1300s, the University of Toulouse allowed professors to physically encourage attentiveness using a rod not thicker than a thumb. Excessive striking was frowned upon, but mild contact was considered pedagogically sound. The rod was, in a way, a cousin of the monastic switch, a tool of humility, not violence, at least in theory. Student reactions to the stick varied. Some students accepted it as part of the system. They viewed correction as a kind of onerous sign the professor thought them worth engaging. Others resented it. One Paris student wrote in his margin notes, "Magister Petrus struck my arm today for laughter. I shall forget neither the blow nor his breath." Some attempted to dodge or block the stick, leading to more formal reprimands. At Bologna, a student named Giacomo reportedly caught the professor's stick mid-air and refused to return it. A scuffle ensued. Giacomo was fined a week's wine allowance and made to write Psalm 119 in Latin as penance. Still, even the proudest students generally accepted the stick as a fixture. Like the cold or the fleas or the lice, it was simply part of academic life. The symbolism of the baculus there was a deeper meaning to the stick. In the church, a baculus was a shepherd's staff used to guide the flock, ward off wolves, and symbolize pastoral care. Bishops carried croziers, abbots held carved staves, so did hermits and pilgrims. In this tradition, the university professor's stick was a spiritual symbol too. It wasn't a weapon, it was a guide, a visual metaphor for his role as a shepherd. Of minds, some professors even blessed their teaching sticks before lecture. Others adorned them with small carvings or Latin inscriptions. A few were buried with them, their rods laid beside their bones like swords beside knights. In one preserved example from Cologne, a teaching stick bears the inscription verbum ferit, non baculus. The word strikes, not the stick, but thee. Students may have disagreed. When the stick backfired, professors weren't immune to critique. Some were mocked for their overuse of the stick called swatters, staff spinners, or even the walking beatitudes. Rumors of particularly strict professors circulated among students like ghost stories. Magister Arnulf never lectured more than 3 lines without raising the stick. Dr. Herman struck a student for mispronouncing substantia twice. Avoid Jerome of Dijon. He counts wrong answers on his fingers, then strikes once per error. These stories were probably exaggerated, but their persistence shows a truth. The stick, while symbolic, could also be a source of fear. One late 14th century diary records a protest in which students all arrived to lecture carrying sticks of their own, claiming they too had authority to strike error. The master was not amused. The disappearance of the stick by the 16th century, the stick began to vanish from university life. Part of this was due to changing ideas about pedagogy. Renaissance humanism emphasized dialogue, reason, and persuasion over correction and obedience. Legal reforms also made corporal punishment harder to justify, especially among adult students, some of whom were nobility or wealthy clerics. The stick faded into memory. By the 1700s, it was a curiosity. By the 1800s, it was a relic. Today, the modern professor carries a laser pointer, or perhaps nothing at all. But the old baculus survives in museum displays, library cases, and woodcuts. Always held high, always pointing forward. A quiet memory of a time when learning was not only pursued, but enforced. He stood at the front of the room, robed slightly, too fine for a first-year student, hands folded neatly behind his back, eyes steady on the examiner. His Latin was impeccable, its pronunciation precisely Parisian. Its references to Peter Lombard and Isidore of Seville flowed with ease. But something felt off. The examiner, an aging doctor of canon law, tilted his head. Hadn't this student stammered his way through disputation last week? Now here he was, quoting Decretum Gratiani from memory. He looked again. This wasn't the student at all. This was a higher WA professional scholar paid to impersonate. A nervous undergraduate during the most important moment of his academic year. And while such impostures were rare, they were not unheard of. In fact, they tell us something odd and deeply human about the medieval university, even in an age of saints and scholars. Some students still tried to cheat their way to a degree. The high-stakes world of oral exams in medieval universities, there were no multiple-choice tests, no essays to submit by parchment post. Almost everything hinged on the oral examination known as the responsio determinatio, or viva voce, face-to-face grilling on theology, law, logic, or grammar. A student stood rarely sat before a panel of masters. They posed questions, sometimes calmly, sometimes mockingly. The student was expected to respond in Latin, without hesitation. These sessions might last several hours. You were tested on everything: your memory of specific glosses and commentaries, your understanding of Aristotle, Boethius, and Augustine, your ability to speak clearly, cite properly, and avoid heresy mistakes were public. Was failure. And success could bring entrance to the next degree level Bachelor of Arts, Master of Theology, or Doctor of Canon Law. Naturally, students were nervous. Some panicked, and a few devised schemes. The rise of the substitute scholar, it began. Quietly, a wealthier student, overwhelmed or unprepared, would approach a skilled upperclassman or struggling lecturer and offer a deal. You take the exam for me. I'll pay you 3 florins on your laundry for a month. The double would. Dressed in the same robe, often they were close in age and build. The room was dim. The panel had poor eyesight. Examiners might be distracted or unfamiliar with the student's face. And if the impersonator had a polished tongue and good recall, he could pass. In some cases, these exam stand-ins were former students who had stayed near the university offering private lessons. They had the knowledge. They had the robes. They needed the money. At Bologna, these figures were known as candidati phantasma, ghost candidates. At Oxford, they were sometimes called inked men, referring to the deep stains on their hands from hours of study, unlike the cleaner-fingered nobles they often impersonated. How they got away with it, the examiners rarely had full student rosters. Photographs didn't exist. ID cards weren't invented. The university rolls were sparse and messy, often in Latinized versions of names. And the exam room was rarely private. There were always people passing, observing, and talking. So a well-coached imposter could blend in easily, especially if he knew the subject, mimicked the real student's speech patterns. The examiner was elderly or distracted. Session was long and crowded. One letter from 1373 describes a double who sat for 3 students in one term, each time wearing a slightly different colored hood. The letter ends with the note, "He would have gone a 4th time, but he sneezed and broke the illusion." The prices of deception payment for such services varied: 1 florin for basic logic or grammar, before 2 for theology or canon law, 4 to 5 for a master's exam extras for memorizing the student's handwriting or dialect in a few cases. Deals were made in kind: a good pair of boots, a goose for Sunday, or the loan of a student's bed during winter. But the risk was high. If caught, both the student and the substitute could be expelled, fined, or in rare cases, communicated. Yet the temptation remained. In one curious case from Paris, a student forged a note from his professor claiming he was too ill to attend the oral response and sent his double in with it. The examiner accepted it until the student's real voice was heard laughing later that night at the tavern. Detecting the fakes, university officials began to wise up. By the late 1300s, examiners were advised to ask personal questions mid-exam, like, "What room do you lodge in?" or "Whose lectures did you attend last Lent?" Require students to sign their name before speaking, matching previous writing samples. Schedule surprise exams with no time to find a double. stationed Bedell's university constables to verify identities. Some colleges started keeping portrait sketches, not true likenesses, but rough drawings of students' distinguishing features. Still, this was difficult in practice. Most examiners focused on the answers, not the faces. And so the impersonators, if careful, could still thrive. Not just students. Occasionally the roles reversed. In one legendary tale from Prague, an aged professor who had grown forgetful allegedly sent a younger assistant to give his lecture under his name. Students, amused but too polite to protest, took notes dutifully. When asked afterward, the professor claimed, "All wisdom flows from the same spring. Whether from my lips or my students, no punishment was issued." Moral complications. To us it may sound absurd. Why risk your degree, your name, or even your soul for a single exam? But in the medieval mind, the pressures were immense. Some students were sent by noble families who expected results. Some simply lacked the resources to study properly and saw no alternative. And the impersonators. Many were brilliant. Scholars without patronage denied degrees because they couldn't afford fees or lacked noble birth. For them, impersonation was not deception, it was employment, performance, a chance to profit from their knowledge in a world that often ignored them. Echoes in modern times, we might laugh now at the idea of students hiring lookalikes to answer questions about Thomas Aquinas or Cicero's Proarchia. But the impulse remains. We still fear exams. We still seek shortcuts. And some still sell their knowledge to those with coin. Today, the ghost exam has become the essay mill, or the hired online test taker. The form changes. But the stress, the desperation, the gamble remains eerily familiar. It was a cool morning in spring. The kind of morning where the chill hung in the stone like an old thought. The cloistered walk between the lecture hall and the dormitory was quiet as it should be. Damp stone tiles stretched beneath arched ceilings. The sound of birds outside echoed faintly through the open arcade. And then a footstep, too loud, too fast. One of the masters turned sharply, robes swaying like a bell. The student halted mid-stride, one boot raised in guilt, his eyes downcast. A pause. Then, with a frown of almost ceremonial disappointment, the master reached into his satchel, produced a small strip of parchment, and handed it over. A noise citation. Because in the medieval university, walking too loudly, especially in cloisters, was not just rude. It was a punishable offense. Why silence mattered to understand why noisy walking was taken so seriously, you must understand what the cloister represented. The cloister was more than a corridor, it was a space of reflection, a breathing pause. Between the bustle of lectures and the strain of disputations, modeled after monastic practice, university cloisters were places where students were expected to walk slowly, speak softly, if at all, avoid running, laughing, or stomping, refrain from singing unless part of a religious procession. It wasn't just about reverence. It was about discipline, order, the training of the soul. The walk from chapel to hall was meant to be contemplative, like a living liturgy. Disrupting that Tevin with poorly heeled shoes was seen as a breach of decorum, the offense of clamouses. Passus University records used the Latin term, clamouses passus, the noisy step, to describe violations of the expected walking conduct, and it could take several forms. Boots clacking on wet stone running between lectures, skipping not common, but mentioned foot dragging, especially in protest rhythmic stomping. As seen in mock processions by bored students, some cloisters even had posted signs, silentium, padim, let there be silence of the feet. The fines were real students caught walking too loudly might receive. A warning from a bedell, a university official, a fine affin, a few denarii, or the forfeiture of lunch privileges, an assigned reflection period in the chapel or library. In rare cases, temporary suspension from cloister access. One Oxford statute from 1387 reads, "Let no scholar make thunder of his walk within the arches of learning. So, let him lose a week's bread and be tasked with polishing the stones he disturbed." It sounds theatrical, but the punishments were real. For young scholars who lived hand-to-mouth, the loss of bread or a meal token could mean an empty belly for a day or more. Cloister crimes. A catalog of curious offenses, the noisy walker, was only one of many curious offenses in the rulebooks of medieval universities. Other minor crimes included laughter after Kumplin, forbidden after the final bell of the day. Students caught giggling in dorm halls could be fined or ordered to write a psalm by hand. Improper robing. Students who wore their academic robes too short, too long, or slung over only one shoulder were cited for disrespect. Public yawning, especially during sermons. If your mouth opened wider than a fig, you could be tapped with a candle snuffer. Ink hoarding, keeping more than 2 pots of ink without permission, especially if stored under the bed. Excessive humming. Not all music was forbidden, but melodic humming in the lecture hall before dawn was grounds for a scolding. One recorded offense from Paris reads simply, "Student sang Psalm 43 in falsetto voice while walking in cloister. Fellow scholars disturbed. Meal withheld." Students were expected to wear soft-soled shoes, often of leather or wool felt, especially in indoor spaces. Those with hard wooden clogs were to remove them before entering the cloister. The University of Bologna even had a shoe-check chamber, a small bench where a student could switch from walking boots to lecture slippers, but not everyone complied. A particularly grating trend emerged in the late 14th century when students began ironing metal studs into their soles to appear wealthier or more knightly. These made loud clacks on stone and drew complaints. One master wrote, "Their pride is louder than their learning." Eventually, metal-studded soles were banned outright, at least within academic spaces. The role of the bedels, the enforcers of cloister quiet, were often the bedels' university staff, who acted as messengers, watchmen, and general disciplinarians. Armed with wooden staffs, they patrolled the cloisters, the lecture halls, and sometimes even the dormitories. A bedel knew every student by gait. One Cambridge tale describes a bedel named Walter who claimed he could identify any student by the sound of his footfall. When blindfolded, he correctly named 12 out of 15. He was eventually promoted to head bedel and given an extra tunic as a reward. Rituals of reconciliation if a student had been especially disruptive, say, running through the cloister during matins or laughing during massy, might be required to perform a public act of reconciliation. This might include sweeping the cloister silently at dawn, reciting a psalm while walking the full length barefoot, writing an apology in Latin, and posting it near the entry gate, sitting beside the bedel for a full lecture. Watching others walk properly, these rituals were often done in silence, not as punishment, but as retraining, a reminder that even footsteps are part of scholarship. Silence was a skill to walk quietly on medieval stone required real technique. Heel first, then toe. Short steps even pace arms close to the sides to prevent swaying eyes down but alert. Some colleges even taught proper walking and orientation, alongside rules for robe folding and candle trimming. Its students were warned that clumsy walking wasn't just embarrassing, it could mark them as outsiders, or worse, foreigners unfamiliar with the customs of the college. The quiet rebellion, of course. Not everyone accepted the rules quietly. In the late 1300s, a small group of Paris students began staging walking protests, where they would march in rhythm, stomp in pattern, or perform dramatic tiptoe lines through the cloister. One such group called themselves Frotras Pedum, the Brothers of the Foot. They were disbanded after one member slid dramatically across the cloister tiles during Lent, knocking over a passing monk. Still, their spirit lingered. And from time to time, a beetle would catch the faint echo of a patterned stomp and squint toward the arcade. In the spring of 1372, the halls of the University of Paris grew tense not over doctrine or wages or even bed space. It was over ink. One week it was there, stacked in jars at the scribe stalls, black, thick, and predictable. The next it was gone. The suppliers said the oak galls had spoiled. No ink, and for a university built on parchment, script, and scribbled marginalia. This was not a small problem. Ink as a scholarly lifeline, ink wasn't optional in the medieval university. It was essential. Students needed it to copy lecture notes, draft letters to patrons, record oral disputations, annotate borrowed manuscripts, write exam responses, pen devotional reflections, and occasionally draw small, rude sketches of professors in the margins. The standard ink called aqua nigra was a thick, dark solution made from crushed oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. It clung to the parchment fibers, drying slowly and darkened over time. Each student was expected to have at least one small inkwell, either of wood, horn, or ceramic. Ink was sold by the vial or ladleful at designated stalls or by traveling ink sellers who roamed the dorms on market days. But now, in spring 1372, the stalls were empty. The first signs of panic at first, the reaction was mild. Professors advised students to write in pencil or, more accurately, a lead stylus. But these left faint marks prone to smudging and were frowned upon for formal records. Soon students began diluting old ink with water, resulting in weak, grayish scribbles. Borrowing ink from classmates, some charging a few denarii per use, attempting to make homemade ink from soot, wine, or even berry juice, none of which adhered well. A group of desperate theology students at the College de Navarre tried boiling walnut husks. The ink was usable, but pungent and reportedly made one reader faint from the odor. The rise of the ink barons. As panic grew, a strange figure emerged, the ink hoarder. These were students who, whether through foresight, luck, or mild obsession, had stockpiled extra jars beneath their beds. Perhaps they had a cousin in the ink trade. Perhaps they'd simply forgotten to return their empties. Whatever the cause, they now had power. One such student, Henry of Metz, reportedly had 6 full jars of black ink in his footlocker. He began charging for access. 1 spoonful equals 1 egg, 2 spoonfuls equals 1 psalm, copied by hand, full jar equals 3-day candle supply or the right to borrow your roommate's blanket for one night. Henry became known as the Scribe King. He carried a wooden ladle and wore ink-stained gloves as a mark of status. Some say he even created a seal using the bottom of his inkwell. He was eventually fined for unlicensed commerce, but by then he had already bartered enough to afford 2 full weeks of roasted meat. The battle of the reds, while black ink was the most used. Red ink, called rubrico, was crucial for headings, emphasis, illuminated capitals, academic seals, liturgical notes. The shortage affected this ink as well, especially since red pigment came from imported cinnabar or local red lead, both expensive and toxic to process. Suddenly, even the modest incipit, the decorative opening line of a text, became difficult to execute. One group of students tried substituting red wine for rubrica. The results were sticky and smelled of fermentation. Another attempted using crushed brick dust. It worked briefly until humidity caused their pages to rot. In a rare twist, a student apothecary named Judith of Rouen gained fame for concocting a stable red ink using safflower and vinegar. She was permitted to sell it publicly and later received a rare commendation from the dean, who wrote in his own borrowed red ink, "Let it be known that Mistress Judith's tincture is both legible and pleasing to the eye. Golden ambitions. Faded glory gold incused only in illuminated manuscripts or final degree scrolls was never widely available. It's made from powdered gold leaf suspended in gum solution. It was expensive, time-consuming, and prone to theft." Yet during the 1372 shortage, gold ink took on mythical status. A rumor spread that one theology student had used gold ink to write his entire master's thesis, thereby blinding the examiner with its brilliance. The real story: he had used brass powder, which flaked off during reading and stained the examiners. Hand still, a black market emerged. Students mixed ground coins into vinegar. A group of scribes secretly melted gilded altar fittings. This ended in expulsion. One poetic soul used ground sunflower petals mixed with egg yolk. The ink shone beautifully for 3 days before turning green. Professorial panic: even professors weren't immune. Some lost access to their regular scribes and had to dictate lectures without written notes. One scholar was said to have recited Aquinas for 2 hours entirely from memory, only to forget the final clause and mutter, "It was something about grace. You know the rest." Exam schedules were adjusted to accommodate ink shortages. Students were told they could respond orally or submit a written summary in whatever medium was available, so long as it stains. One student submitted his disputation in charcoal on a bedsheet. It was accepted, conditionally. Recovery. In reflection, by late summer, the crisis had passed. Ink shipments resumed. The oak gall supply recovered. The price of a vial returned to normal. The bartering stopped. Henry of Metz's ladle was confiscated. Judith's red ink was quietly adopted by the Copyist Guild. But the episode left its mark. A new university policy required students to keep one sealed ink ration in reserve, much like emergency candles. The library implemented an ink-sharing shelf, where students could deposit and withdraw with a wax token system. A pamphlet circulated titled, "How to Make Ink Without Losing Friends or Consciousness." And above one lecture hall door, someone carved the words, "Let ink flow freely, lest words wither in the mind." It wasn't loud, but it was certain. A hollow sound that echoed off the wet stone and stirred blankets in the student dormitory. One by one, the scholars groaned, sat up, and reached for their robes. Some lit their small wax tapers, others dressed in the dark. They moved toward the chapel in pairs, shuffling bleary-eyed and silent, because to miss Massivin once could mean a warning, twice a fine. 3 times, and you might find yourself writing out the Book of Psalms, in Latin, from memory. But worse still than missing Mass was something more subtle, more dangerous, sleeping through it. And in 14th century universities, that particular offense came with its own punishments, some spiritual, some academic, and some deeply, embarrassingly public. Why Mass was mandatory, most medieval universities were closely tied to the church. Professors were clerics. Many students were in minor orders. Every day, lectures paused at least twice to accommodate the divine office. With matins, lauds, and prime, often beginning before dawn, attendance at morning Mass wasn't optional, it was a pillar of academic life. It grounded students in routine. It reminded them of spiritual priorities. It gave professors a chance to scan who was present and awake. Skipping Mass was like skipping class, chapel, and roll call all in one. And it was watched closely. The drowsing problem, but students were, above all else, human. They stayed up late, studying or whispering. Some snuck out for food or ale. Some simply tossed and turned beneath threadbare blankets, anxious over exams, rent, or doctrinal paradoxes. And when they finally arrived in the chapel, warm, dim, incense heavy, they dozed. Some nodded quietly, some snored. A few slumped over the edge of the pew. And at least one student, a certain Guillaume of Bijoume of Bayeux, was recorded to have muttered in his sleep during Mass, reciting a passage of Cicero that had nothing to do with the epistle of the day. The friar celebrating the Mass paused, looked up, and quietly declared, "Either this boy dreams of Rome, or he studies while asleep." Catching the sleepers, monastic priests and university sacristans developed ways to detect sleeping students. Shoe checks. If a student's boots slid too far forward on the floor, they were probably slumped. Watching nods were easy to spot. In rows of otherwise upright scholars, candle tilt. In winter months, students carried their own candles. If a flame flickered sideways, the hand was likely limp. The feather test. One inventive deacon in Avignon was said to carry a goose feather, which he used to tickle suspected sleepers. If they didn't flinch, they were fined. But perhaps the most common method was the bell tap, a short clang rung during pauses in the liturgy. It wasn't part of the service. It was a wake-up call. If you jumped, eyes wide, it was too late. You'd been caught. The official statutes by the mid-1300s, universities began to codify the rules around liturgical sleep. The University of Oxford's Dormitory Manual, Consuetudines Discipulorum, lists: "No scholar shall knowingly slumber during divine office, nor lean against pillar or pew so as to deceive the eye." Punishments included writing assigned psalms or passages from Augustine serving breakfast to the friars for a week, public confession in front of classmates of the offense, losing access to the warmed seats nearest the altar for 1 full month. In Paris, one rule book stated, Let the penitent who dreams in Latin be tasked with translating his sleep into French if he remembers it. Sleep-talking scholars, sleep-talking was treated with a mix of amusement and suspicion. If a student mumbled philosophical phrases, it was seen as dedication, perhaps the unconscious working of the soul. If he murmured poetry or curses, it was considered problematic. One professor famously claimed, "A student's sleep reveals more than his exam." Students who repeatedly talked in their sleep were sometimes asked to keep sleep journals or report to a confessor. One note from a dormitory head reads, "Brother Andre spoke of Plato during rest but named the wrong dialogue." Sign repetition. The quiet art of the sleep mask. Some clever students tried to fake wakefulness. A popular trick was the sleep mask technique, tilting the head just enough to appear thoughtful but actually dozing. Others placed a book upright in front of them, hiding their closed eyes. One student cut 2 holes in his cap so he could wear it over his eyes and claimed to be thinking. None of these were foolproof. A professor at the University of Salamanca caught one such student and ordered him to sit through the next 3 masses without blinking. He blinked repeatedly and was assigned to wash the chapel floor with vinegar. Why it mattered? Why did universities care so much about a few closed eyes during Mass? Because to sleep during the liturgy was more than laziness. It was seen as a spiritual insult to the priest, the university, and even to God. It reflected poorly on the student's discipline. It endangered his academic record. And in some particularly theological colleges, it was considered a sign of pride, the belief that one did not need grace or learning or humility. Professors often reminded their students, "If your body sleeps, let not your soul slumber with it." And yet, despite the warnings, students continued to nod. Stories of legendary sleepers, some dozers passed into university legend. Martin the Flat-Nosed, who allegedly fell asleep at every morning Mass for a full term. His punishment: serving as a human candle holder during Compline for a month. Elena Flanders, who once sleepwalked into the sanctuary and had to be quietly guided back by a friar, she became known as Saint Somnia. Tomas, the Unrepentant, who argued that if God had given us dreams, surely he would not mind if they visited during sermons. He was made to write 100 times, "Dream not in God's house, lest he dream not of you." The gentle tolerance of the masters, despite the rules, many professors understood. They, too, had once been students. They remembered the sleepless nights, the shivering mornings, the confusing Latin, and the unyielding benches. So while discipline was maintained, a quiet mercy often reigned. A tap on the shoulder, a whispered warning, a warm bowl of broth the next morning, accompanied by "Try again, son, but bring your eyes with you next time." Sometimes no punishment was issued at all, just a knowing smile and the silent recording of one more soul trying clumsily, earnestly, to stay awake through the long, slow song of learning. In a small lecture room at the University of Prague in the early 1400s, 2 students stood facing each other. One held a parchment, the other a chalk. They were arguing not over love nor money, but over the logical structure of a syllogism. The room was warm, the crowd of peers tightly packed, and the master overseeing the session had dozed slightly. In his chair, the dispute had escalated. Words sharpened, accusations flew, Latin phrases turned into insults, and citations from Aristotle were hurled like stones. Then came the breaking point. The second student, Tribert, son of a tannerek, accused his opponent of misquoting Boethius. The first Jacoba, a nobleman's son, replied not with words, but with the slap of a glove thrown in full view of the audience. In the medieval world, that meant a challenge, not to a follow-up debate, but to a duel. What was a disputation? To understand how this happened, we need to understand the disputatio. This was the cornerstone of medieval university learning, formal academic. Debate conducted in Latin, following strict structure. A proposition is posed, often theological, legal, or logical. One student defends it, citing authorities. Another opposes it, trying to break it apart. The master moderates and delivers a final response. Disputations were public. They could last hours, sometimes days. They were exercises in logic, rhetoric, memory, and humility. but sometimes they went wrong. The temptation of pride students were encouraged to argue fiercely but respectfully. Debates were not meant to be personal, but pride was hard to contain. A sharp jab in Latin might win laughs from your peers. A misstep could mark you as a fool. A clever turn of phrase might earn praise from the master and, perhaps, a place in the next clerical post. So tempers flared, especially when the topics were controversial. The nature of predestination, the legality of indulgences, the proper form of Aristotelian logic, whether the soul was divided by faculties or unified by essence to us. It may sound abstract. To them, it was life and truth itself. The famous Prague incident, the glove slap incident, recorded in the Chronic Studii Pragensis, became infamous. Jacob, the noble student, believed he had been insulted not just intellectually but socially. He took the Latin phrase te invideo stultitiam tuum. I envy your foolishness as a challenge to his honor. He responded as a knight might by tossing his glove. Robert, from a poorer background, refused to back down. Date was whispered. A field outside the city walls. Witnesses. Seconds. A duel. But news reached the rector before it could happen. Both students were suspended, stripped of their robes, and assigned to spend a full season translating Aristotle's categories by hand. Separately, one chronicler notes dryly, they dueled not with blades, but with ink and bled boredom for 40 nights. Were academic duels common? Not quite. But dual threats over academic debates did occur, especially when noble students were involved. Some examples. At Oxford in 1349, 2 students argued over Augustine's interpretation of time. One drew a dagger, was expelled. At Bologna in 1412, a student dared to contradict a visiting professor's stance on just war. He was challenged to a duel, but the opponent got lost on the way. In Paris, a wealthy benefactor's son was accused of plagiarism during a disputation. He offered a duel. The challenger replied with a quote from Cicero and declined. Most such threats ended with public reconciliation, a ritual handshake, shared prayer, or, in one case, a jointly written poem. But the tension between reason and rage was always present. The disputation code of conduct. After several incidents, universities began to issue formal guidelines. One Oxford statute from 1390 reads, "Let no scholar in disputation raise hand nor voice above that of reason. Let the quarrel end with citation, not with steel." Other rules included no personal insults, even in Latin, no allusions to family. Background: no gesturing with quills in a threatening manner, no stomping during rebuttals, no slamming of books or walking out before the master gives the final word. A student found in violation might be banned from debates or made to copy logical treatises as penance. Sword and parchment. Some students came from knightly families and had fencing training. They brought with them swords, daggers, and tempers. One story from Salamanca tells of a student who tried to bring a sheathed sword into a disputation for inspiration. He was made to leave it at the door end, then forgot to pick it up for a week. Others practiced verbal fencing, stringing together elaborate, showy arguments full of flourishes and traps. This led to the term duellum syllogisticum, duel of syllogisms. Professors loved this phrase. Students, less so. Clever responses to avoid conflict. Some students developed witty techniques to diffuse rising tension, feigning Latin misunderstanding. Did you say fallacia or fallacia? I must have heard wrong, citing an ambiguous authority, as the blessed Anselm said, or might have said, depending on which manuscript you have. Complimenting the opponent mid-debate, your error is brilliant. A lesser mind wouldn't have made it so elegantly. Feigning sudden humility, perhaps I have erred. The candlelight confused my mind. These strategies often earned smiles and avoided glove slaps. The sword that was forged in Latin, and yet even after the Prague incident, tales of near duels continued. One traveling professor in Vienna began each disputation by placing a wooden sword on the lectern, saying, "Let this suffice as a blade, cut with words, not iron." Another in Heidelberg awarded students a paper medal shaped like a dagger after particularly intense but respectful debates. They were called peacemakers.